Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Anne Tiernan. I'm a professor and director of the Policy Innovation Hub at Griffith University. GBS is the business school is a long-term sponsor of the CEDA Women in Leadership program, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity today. I'm very lucky to get these gigs, as I call them, from time to time. Simon, that was a very provocative talk in some ways.
Good.
And quite wide-ranging in lots of others. I think, what people don't know about Simon that I learned is that he's about to release a picture book later in the year, and so this...
Illustrated Ethics.
Illustrated, no, it's not. It's the Spider Song.
Yes.
So I think it's probably no surprise to you now to have heard his storytelling. I think those were two really powerful stories of Whitlam and of the taxi driver. But this idea that people don't see is, I think, a really interesting one. But I just want to kind of, not challenge you, but I just want to ask you about, because, I think, I found aspects of your talk like incredibly persuasive. We need a new system of governance. We need to think we're not coping with complexity. There's kind of a paradox in what people are reaching for in populist politics. And if we look at the spectacle unfolding in the US, if we look at the Brexit, if we look at some of the results in our own election, the drive for easy answers, the drive for someone to build a great big wall is really strong. So
I think the strongest drive, one of the strongest drivers in human history, has been the need for certainty. You can imagine living in a prehistoric environment where apparently random acts kill members of your family, destroy your life, and we just are not built to deal with that. So we invent things that can give us a sense of control. So we'll go into caves and we'll do magic realist paintings where we say that will help us to hunt the animal, or we'll have spirits or gods that if they can be propitiated, if we just sacrifice in the same format, that will assure our success. It will eliminate the uncertainty. This is the way up until the great Cartesian revolution with the Enlightenment, where instead of there being something out there which is other and greater than us, which we try to satisfy, Descartes, he engages in this incredibly radical process of skepticism where he says, I'm going to doubt everything that it is possible to doubt, even the evidence of my own senses. And some of you will know that at the end of this great period of doubting, he comes up with this single thought that he cannot doubt, which is that he is thinking. And then he says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I must exist. That's the one thing I can be certain of. Now, what people don't understand is that the moment he does that, he completely revolutionises things where certainty becomes inside a human. We become that, and then it's allied to the rise of mathematics and science. Again, a whole series of systems which are about control. So when you get into with this kind of deep human impulse, when you get to a world like ours where there's lots of uncertainty, lots of complexity, people are easily seduced by the siren call of any kind of fundamentalist, whether it's religious or political, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, because what they promise you, Anne, they say, it's all right. Yeah, it may seem complex, but you don't have to think about it anymore. You don't have to deal with this. You just do what I tell you and you'll be fine. And so that's what's happening at the moment. It's a struggle for, and put this in very bold terms, it's a struggle for our humanity, for how much we are prepared to be true to our nature as creatures that have to live with uncertainty because we're ultimately responsible for the choices we make.
So are you optimistic?
Yeah.
That this power shift can happen? Because I see a great struggle, as I think about some of the people who are making those kinds of promises, they look tediously the same as a lot of the men that you describe who are clinging to this power.
That's why you've got to back diversity, because it's the only, we know it. I mean, you go back to the monocultures in agriculture, which were destroyed by a single pest. It's the diversity that you get seeded throughout a population, whether it's in agriculture or human societies, which gives you the capacity to find that moment of resilience, which would never have been possible if you just levelled everything to be exactly the same. And it's an insight. It sounds counterintuitive, you see, and you're right to point this out. People think when there's so much complexity, what you need to do is to get the monochrome dominant control, one single person who's going to stamp authority on it. It's precisely the wrong thing to do. You've got to actually think deeper. You've got to go below to see what you really need. And what you really need is what diversity offers, those different perspectives, so that you can see the tiger. Because otherwise you're gone.
Yeah, but the result, and Simon and I were talking about this during lunch. I'm a political scientist, so I went to the data on the July 2 election. And we've now got the least diverse parliament since 1983. And people in decision-making positions, we've seen a decline in women's representation in the ministry. It's less than 25%, and it's just not fantastic in the House of Reps. In safe seats and so on. We've seen a lot of people. Can you envisage a time, if this is a transition and people are kind of struggling to cope with complexity and uncertainty, maybe it will pass, but not anytime soon.
Not unless
Australian Parliament.
Like, I'm making an argument for you today as to why diversity matters on a larger ground than perhaps has been talked about before. If I have convinced you of this argument, then what I hope you would do is that you would use that to inform your own decisions and perhaps to influence others. Because if you don't understand what the larger argument that's at stake, then you won't know why sometimes you have to make a choice for diversity for its own sake. You'll say, oh, it's an optional extra. It doesn't really matter. All I need to do is just pick this person because it's more convenient or something like that, or they're like me. What you've got to do is you've got to enlarge the notion even of your own rational self-interest if you find my argument compelling. And then that means when we vote, or when people you influence might vote, you might actually say, okay, that may not be the person who perfectly represents my own views, but the diversity that I will help to introduce into this parliament or this corporation or whatever, that is a good which produces larger and better results given the complexity we've got. But unless we understand it in those terms, no, I don't see it changing. But I'm an optimist because I think every part of my experience is that the Australian population responds to good arguments if you just offer them. You've just got to explain it and say that's why it matters. And then most Australians will say, okay, fair enough.
And I think, it was so interesting that you picked up on the frankly appalling events in the Northern Territory this week. And just the way the public has responded to that actually does give you cause for optimism.
Yeah.
In an interesting kind of way. And again, the lack of diversity, it seems, in that context, and an interesting legal point that you might point out in a minute, really people just couldn't see that what they were doing was the wrong thing.
Look, the worst disservice that our politicians do to us is that they treat us as if we are base. They often appeal to our fear and greed, and even when it succeeds, they leave us feeling terrible about ourselves. That's all you thought of us? You didn't think that there was anything more noble about us that you could have appealed to? Because I can tell you, I travel all over this country, and Australians are not angels, they're not demons, they're just basically decent people, and their instincts are basically good, particularly when you give them arguments and reasons. Now, the point that Anne's referring to, very few people know that, and I looked at it yesterday, within the Juvenile Justice Act in the Northern Territory, the legislation which governs the detention of these poor children, there's a section that was introduced called Section 215, and it grants complete immunity for all civil and all criminal offences to any of those guards, for the commissioners, completely immune from the application of the civil and criminal law, providing they are acting, in inverted commas, in good faith. No wonder these people were willing to do it in front of the cameras. Why give us stuff? The Parliament has decided you will never be held accountable, no matter what you do, no matter what law you break, in the treatment of those children. Now that's not about cutting off a few rotten apples in the barrel. These are the people who built the barrel. And we've got a tendency in Australia at the moment to remove judicial oversight, to remove media oversight, to remove any barriers to do with the way in which executive power is exercised. And we buy it because they appeal to issues of safety and things like that. Well, the Australian people have seen, this is what happens. It's children wearing hoods shackled to chairs. That's what you get. And I think the instincts of the public at large, as you've said, is to say, that's not who we are. That's not what we do to our children.
No, it's not who we are, but to sort of pick up Kyle's earlier point, where was our responsibility to be concerned about what was being debated in the Parliament or the Legislative Assembly in the Northern Territory? We didn't exercise it. So it's kind of an interesting civic responsibility dimension there. Now, look, we might go to questions because I can see the CEDA team are moving around. I can certainly see one down the back, and then I'll come over here, and then over here. Oh, sorry, whoever's got the microphone there, because there are two pieces of paper up in the air.
Hello, Amanda Yates from the Department of Transport and Main Roads. I wanted to ask a question about mediocrity in leadership. And I did notice on the guest list there are a few people here that I have worked for, so clearly I'm not referring to them, their leadership.
You've got to speak truth to power, come on.
My question is really, or my observation is that industry and government can actually have a very high tolerance for mediocre leadership for long periods of time and can, at least at the surface, appear to continue to function in spite of mediocre leadership. I wonder whether you might be able to comment, given the things you talked about today and the future that you've described, how mediocre leadership will be tolerated in the future and what diversity might bring to that.
Well, the first thing I think we have to do is to get clear about the difference, and there is a difference in my mind, between management and leadership. So the way I think of it is this. Imagine a cork in a stream. There's a group of people who are keeping the cork steady so no one falls in the water. They pull the levers, push the buttons, and everybody's kept dry, but they're not controlling where the cork is going. That's management. And then there are leaders who are those who impart direction, even against the flow of the stream. Now, those are both necessary functions. Sometimes they reside in a single person, but we should understand that they require different things of us. And particularly leadership, I think, requires the exercise of moral courage, because what it effectively requires you to do, I think of leadership as being defined as constructive subversion. The job of leaders, in my view, is to subvert unthinking custom and practice of the kind that the taxi driver talked about. Leaders should never say, oh yeah, it's fair enough that we do it just because everybody does it. They should challenge that, but not to destroy the place, but to help it become more like the thing it says it wants to be. But that takes a remarkable courage. Now, I think the tolerance, however, for this is going to reduce, for poor leadership will reduce over time. And this is particularly so, I think, in the commercial world, maybe in government too, I'm not sure. But the evolution that's taking place at the moment is that there's a new ecology of business beginning to emerge, which is based on an ecology of meaning, where you cannot actually, you go into banks, I don't know if there's anyone from the banks here, but pretty much the banks offer the same products and services. You can't distinguish them that much in terms of what they do, but where they can distinguish themselves is according to what they mean or stand for. And that's how they compete for and attract employees and customers and capital. Now, in an ecology of meaning, the kinds of leadership attributes that I've been outlining in response to your question starts to matter a whole lot more. It's not just the management that keeps things going. It actually matters that you impart purpose and you get alignment with the values and principles. And I think the need to evolve to fit into that ecology of meaning will be a big driver, but there'll be a lot of pain along the way as people try and work out how better to do this.
Yeah, Samantha Phillips with Origin Energy. I'm curious, you were talking about, is the balance in the government in our change for governance structure appropriate? How do you feel about quotas in terms of mandated quotas? I've come from Scandinavia for the last 10 years, and I have a very different and changing and evolving view on quotas and how we change those balance to be better represented.
So if I was to redefine quotas as KPIs, or whatever the latest version of that is, key performance indicators, there's probably some new acronym, and said that's a KPI for a business, very few people in business would have any objection to that. They're used to meeting targets where if you don't meet the target, there's a consequence. And for some reason or other, we've got ourselves into a mindset where we don't think that we should do the same thing in terms of meeting targets or KPIs for a particular blend in the workforce. And I think the voluntary measures so far that have been relied upon have been proven to be ineffective. And so I've wrestled with this myself, like you perhaps, for a long time. I'm convinced that there's an equal distribution of talent. So if there were quotas in place, you would be able to find as many talented women as men. I understand the notion of merit accordingly would still be met, but I just think that we need to try and find a way to break through the resistance, which is allowing people to do nothing at all. And I always opt, if I'm ever given a choice, to a voluntary principles-based approach in which people choose to do something which is right, particularly if I can see it as being in their own self-interest as well. But I'm also willing to accept that if that doesn't work, and it seems to be working too slowly, then you need to set targets which have consequences, which is effectively saying the same thing as quotas. But as I say, it's not a novelty to do this. Every business sets targets for all sorts of things that they do, and they work to achieve them, and if they don't, people have to give an account as to why they've not achieved them. It should be in this area too.
Well, I think, and it's actually quite interesting in the political context, the Labor Party set a target of 50% representation in caucus by 2025. If, as it seems likely, they hold the seat of Herbert, they'll have achieved 40%, whereas the Coalition is very vehemently opposed to targets, as we know, and, really, there's a lot of internal thinking about the need to review that. I think transparency and reporting around this kind of stuff really helps too.
And look, you can encourage, if the electorate was thinking, as I've hoped it might, about why this really matters, then the self-interest of political parties will be to put up candidates, not just in terms of gender diversity, but we've got remarkable pools of talent in terms of cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, all sorts of things in this country which we underutilise. Yeah. And if the public started to say that, then the political parties would be hopefully responding as much to demand side as supplying it.
Maybe that's what the people were saying on July 2.
Joanne Wright from the University of Queensland. Simon, thanks very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. I'd like to take you to the end of your presentation, and I recognise that you talked in generalities. And I accept your argument about looking at how people who are excluded from traditional structures of power. And I think that's really interesting, and I think it's quite compelling. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what sort of empirical evidence there might be to back that up. Because I think if you look at how women vote, women tend to vote, generalisation, for religious-leaning conservative parties, for law and order parties, for exactly the sort of formal power structures that you mentioned.
Yeah. So I'm a philosopher, not a political scientist. They would have evidence, I'm afraid. All I've got is argument. So I actually don't have any evidence at all. But I have, that's why I expressed it as a hunch rather than a settled view, to invite some reflection about this. It's hard to know. I'll take the statistics as you give them as being accurate in terms of what women typically vote for. It's hard to know whether or not that's been done because there hasn't been a crystallisation, if you like, of awareness about what attributes women, for example, as those who've been excluded from traditional power structures, might actually have within their own resources, and that are not just a matter of justice, but actually of some practical utility to a society trying to rethink its governance in the circumstances I described. So maybe if more people, men and women, were to reflect on that, it may actually change some of the things that you referred to as the traditional voting patterns. But beyond that, I don't know. I don't know. You probably, Anne, do you know about those figures as to why women... Tell me if I've paraphrased this incorrectly, but I think the suggestion was that women tend to vote more often than not for conservative religious men. Is that it? Is that it?
Wouldn't necessarily be conservative men. It could be conservative women.
Or women. But the people they vote for tend to be conservative...
Law and order.
Law and order. That women tend to favour that.
I'd want to have a look at the more recent data. I think like the whole world is clouded by the Republican primaries and the Democratic kind of... That's all kind of that's happening for me at the moment. I'd want to have a look at the data. But clearly we have had a real drift in this most recent election away from the major parties and towards, maybe seeking some diversity, whether that's gender or, away from the major parties or whatever. I'm just not up to date enough with the gender breakdown of the current result.
It may also be just another thought that women themselves have drunk the Kool-Aid. And when they don't believe about their own way of managing power to be an effective model, they may have actually accepted the propositions of the older system, and therefore they vote for it without actually recognising what resides within their own experience and methods. I mean, it's just another thought perhaps that might explain that.
We've got another question down the back.
Luke McElwain from Morgans Financial. A question for Simon, and just following on from what you've been talking about, Simon, have you got a comment on breakdown of trust in society, whether that be through government process, political process?
Yes, it's obviously been profound and precipitous, and it occurs for the reasons I gave. When institutions say one thing and they do something else, that invariably destroys trust. Now, the interesting thing about trust is that traditionally we accommodate a loss of trust by increasing the range of transaction costs to compensate. So, Economics 101, people will know low trust is a high cost environment, high trust, low cost, because just to take a trite example, if you can reach an agreement, shake hands with a person and know that they will honour what's been agreed, that's so much more economically efficient than having to have contracts and enforcement provisions and all the rest. So our society has looked a lot at trust and how it's changed. Interestingly, as Rachel Botsman was pointing out at a thing I was at a few weeks ago, even as trust in institutions has declined, trust in individuals has increased.
Yep.
So you'll now get into cars with Uber, a complete stranger, and entrust them to take you from A to B. Airbnb, complete strangers will come and live in your house or a property, and it can only be to do with trust. So there's something about trust in institutions because of their power and their scale, which has gone down while we've been transferring it into other places. But the more interesting question, and I think this is a concept which has been completely understudied, underthought about, is not about trust, but about legitimacy. Because when institutions lose legitimacy, then no amount of money will see people deal with them.
Absolutely.
And we've come perilously close in some cases to the loss of legitimacy. And this I only understood this. When Gaddafi was hiding in the deserts of Libya, I remember asking myself, look, how can this happen? You know, what's this guy not got? He's got all of the wealth of his oil fields, he's got mercenaries, he's got great stockpiles of weapons, he's got all of the organs of the state, and yet he's the one hiding in the desert. What's he not got? Legitimacy. Once that's broken, you're finished.
I think that's such an important point, and if people haven't seen it, the 2016 Edelman Trust Barometer on this bears that out so strongly. At a time when there is a real, crisis of democracy or crisis of legitimacy, extraordinary levels of trust in the front line, in the people with whom people are having interactions, it's actually a fantastic basis to build on, really. And that's why diversity, I guess, in the interactions that people have with frontline people, with whoever they're encountering in your businesses is so important. And I guess it's why today I read that EY's had a report about cultural and linguistic diversity in the professions.
Yeah. Look, and just going back to the trust question, I'm not, again, a pessimist about this. I actually think that rebuilding trust is entirely possible. It's just that what you've got to do, you've got to be prepared to be quite brave, particularly if you're an organisation, and you've got to look in the mirror and you've got to ask in a really honest and thorough way, are we the organisation we say we are? Would any reasonable person encountering us say, yeah, that's who they are? So we developed a tool, we call it Everest, which is like a really highly polished mirror that does this, and others do similar things. It's not about doing employee engagement surveys, they'll tell you other sorts of things. It's about asking and answering just one question. To what degree are we truly like the thing we claim to be? And it's not just about perceptions, it's also have our systems, have our policies, have our structures been put in place in a way that reinforces what we want to be, or is it undermining it? I'll give you an example. Funds management, financial advice. Years ago I did some work for MLC. Just when they were introducing new standards for training and auditing advisors, fantastic piece of work, but when they presented it to the committee I chaired, they said, have you got any questions? I said, oh yeah, just out of interest, how do you measure and reward their performance? I said, oh, it's easy, we do it on volume of sales. And that was it. I said, why that? Why that? I said, well, that's what everybody does. That's the way the industry operates. So I just asked them, hasn't it occurred to you that despite all these other things about training and auditing, the message you are sending to these people by that one thing alone is, actually, we don't care how you do it. We don't care at all, just as long as you do a lot of it. Those people out in the field, they'd listen to the company saying, oh, we're all about, matching the right product to the right person. They'd say, no, you're not. It's rubbish. All you care about is this. So companies, government departments, everybody, ethics centres, it's a tough question, but every time you find that you are not what you say you are, that's where the tiger lives. It's that cynicism that comes through the perception of hypocrisy. And it's entirely fixable, but you've got to be prepared to do that work.
Thank you so much, Simon. And I think, that's my takeaway from today. The line of the day, I think, is cynicism is an acid that eats at communities. And I think that's, such a powerful thought. So I think Simon's encouraging you all to go out and be strategic corporals. And I'm getting very intense eyes from Kyle Murphy down here. So can you join me in thanking Simon Longstaff